Welcome, everyone, to the very first episode of the Ledge podcast. I'm Mark Wasilio. I'm the MLA for Fort Garry, and I wanted to create a podcast dedicated to Manitoba provincial politics. We don't have much right now when it comes to podcasts exploring Manitoba politics. And over the years, as an elected official, both at the Winnipeg School Division and now at the province, I've seen with every passing year less media coverage and less discussion on provincial politics. And most of what passes for news coverage on provincial politics is pretty manufactured. It's from the communications teams from both major political parties, which means that many issues are not getting discussed and many leading Manitoba voices are not getting heard. Manitobans are fed a pretty steady diet of media spin rather than news, and it's important issues of our day don't get the time and attention that they deserve. So I'm hoping to change that, and I'm hoping to be able to take the time to talk to Manitobans about their politics and to bring voices to light that don't normally get heard. So on this episode, we're going to give you a progressive take on the Kinew government's most recent budget, and we're going to talk constituency politics, some of the issues that I hear as an MLA over and over again, and give some background and context. And finally, I want to talk about Premier Kinew's recent ethic troubles where Manitobans should be concerned. So on this episode, we're going to give you a progressive take on the Kinew government's second budget. We also want to talk constituency politics. What are some of the issues I'm hearing as an MLA and what the context are behind it? And finally, we're going to examine BomberGate, the plane rides that the Premier got to the Grey Cup, and why Manitobans should care about what happened there. So I hope you enjoy, and here's the podcast. So recently, Wab Kinew released his second budget of his administration, and from a progressive perspective, it's beyond disappointing. There's no vision here, no attempt to address any of Manitoba's multiple challenges. In fact, I'd characterize it as an issue-managed budget from an issue management government. And you're probably wondering what that means. Well, basically, issue management is where you're always playing defense, that you basically take the criticism that you're receiving and you address it in order to make it sort of go away or to mitigate it. And basically, the budget reads like that. It's a shopping list of criticism they've received over the past year, and they provide little bits of money to each of those areas that they're being criticized without actually doing anything major or putting enough money into it or a strategy that actually would address the challenges that people are concerned about. And the key flaw in this budget is it accepts the PC fiscal policies of the past, including tax cuts for the rich. And when you accept tax cuts for the rich, what that means is you also accept PC austerity, which means underfunding of social services like health and education and childcare. It's more of a public relations document than a serious plan for the future. So this year's theme was build, 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 and the idea that if we invest in infrastructure, it'll actually help build our economy. That's very true, but the province has got an infrastructure deficit of over $11 billion. I think the city of Winnipeg alone is over $6 billion. If you take the school boards, there's another billion there. So it's a serious problem. It needs addressing, and the problem with this budget is that it just takes a small bite out of it, and there isn't really any plan to tackle all the infrastructure deficits here in Manitoba. And of course, a lot of it are promises that they've already made and that they were always going to do. There's not much new here. And one of the big criticisms they received from the opposition is that they were not building schools. And so this budget basically addresses that. So it's repackaged old promises with a theme this year. At the same time, the government is actually taking actions that are hurting our economy. Probably one of the major things that a province can do is invest in research and development. With that, you create new products, new innovations, which create new jobs and grow our economy. We're seeing that the universities, which are the engines of these growth, are being underfunded. In fact, U of W is running a massive deficit and is talking about laying off professors and closing departments. We're seeing this government refusing to provide healthcare coverage to international students. We're one of only 2 provinces that does that, which means that if you come to study in Manitoba, you have to pay for private healthcare in order to study here. Well, it's expensive enough to come as an international student. So if the choice is between going to Saskatchewan that doesn't charge that or coming to Manitoba, you're going to go to Saskatchewan. And so we're losing sort of the best and brightest students. But the critical fact that not a lot of people are talking about is the Kinew government has actually slashed the research budget in Manitoba. They cut it by 48%, over $15 million. So the time that we should be investing in our economy, they're actually cutting back. And in this year's budget, they have only put $100,000 into research, which doesn't even cover the cost of inflation. So the major problem right now facing Manitoba working and middle-class families is affordability. Manitoba leads the country with the fastest growing rents. We lead the country with the fastest growing grocery store prices. Middle and low-income Manitobans have seen their wages stagnate. We have over 56,000 people on EIA and over 170,000 people in Manitoba. 1 in 4 Manitoba workers who earn less than a living wage. And most of these people are women with children under the age of 18, and many are newcomers and people of color. And we are once again become the child poverty capital of Canada. This budget doesn't do anything to address any of that. In fact, we see a lot of empty performative politics when it comes to affordability. This government brought back the gas tax, but they made it 1.5 cents cheaper. Now, nobody's going to notice those savings, and 60% of that goes to corporations and businesses. Many low-income people don't even own cars and use public transit. There's no new funding has been put in transit, and transit fees keep skyrocketing year and year. So for people who need the help the most when it comes to transportation, they're going to be paying more under this budget. The people that need the help the least won't even notice that they're paying less. Now, this move is going to cost the Treasury, and we're talking about 1.5 cents off of gas, $34 million. And that's money we don't have. That's money that the government has to borrow and pay interest on, and that your grandchildren will have to pay back for something that's really not going to make any difference in anybody's lives. It's going to end up costing you more because you have to pay for the interest. Then we have the hydro freeze. The Kinew government is pledging to freeze hydro this year. Well, hydro's deeply in debt, so they will have to borrow the money to do that, and they got to pay it back with interest. And they have been signaling to the province that they want to see rate hikes, massive rate hikes, over the next 3 years, well above inflation. And so you may get a freeze this year, which you probably won't notice on your bills, but you will notice for the next 3 years that your hydro bill is going up, exponentially. So then we have an affordable housing crisis in Manitoba. We have a shortage of affordable houses. And that's defined for people as not paying more than 30% of your income in housing. Now, the Right to Housing Coalition in Manitoba estimates that we need 1,000 affordable housing units every year for the next 10 years to keep up. And more money for housing in this budget, but nowhere near the 1,000 units needed, and no pledge to build 1,000 units a year for the next 10 years. So our population grows. I think there's one estimate that Winnipeg grew by 45,000 people in the last 2 years. We are not keeping up, and we're actually getting further and further behind. But the province has also brought in tax breaks for homeowners. So they raised the educational property tax credit to $1,600 per home. Now, everyone gets it, even if you live in a multi-million-dollar mansion, and compare that to what renters get. About 40% of Manitobans rent. In my riding, that number goes up to 50%, and they receive out of this budget an extra $50 a year. So homeowners, including the very wealthy, get $1,600 a year in credits. Renters get a total of $675. That's close to 3 times more benefit to homeowners than renters. And so by virtue of owning property, you're better off. And the other thing that Manitobans are dealing with is last year, average rent went up $1,000 a year. So you may be getting $675 from the government, but your rent went up $1,000 last year, and it's going to go up again this year. We also have a program called Rent Assist. And what that is, it's a federal provincial program that subsidizes rent for low-income Manitobans. But there's a limited number of money in the program. So when it runs out, they just cut you off. And that happened twice last year where the province refused to fund the program fully. And so when the federal money ran out, people, families who were on this list who needed that subsidy to keep a roof over their head were cut off by this government, which, one of their stated goals is to end homelessness. It's kind of a strange way of doing it. The other problem we see with housing is that we are a rent control province, and yet we're the fastest growing rents in Canada. And people are wondering, well, how could that possibly be? Well, we have a loophole in our law that allows landlords to apply the province to get around the rental cap. So last year, the cap was about 3%, and average rents went up 10%. And some buildings went up as high as 30% in 1 year. And that leads to rent evictions. That's where long-term residents have to move because they no longer can afford their building. Now, there's no limits on this loophole. A landlord can make cosmetic changes. They can put some paint and do some flooring, and they can apply to get around the cap. And the renovations most likely would have happened anyways. And basically they're doing this to sort of get around the law. And there's no limit about how many times they can do this. Some buildings I've heard this is happening year over year where people are seeing above guideline rent increases. Now, Wab Kinew promised to close the loophole, and we are now 2 years into his legislative session, and he's clearly broken that promise. He did last year bring a piece of legislation, put it on the order paper that was meant to address this loophole, but he didn't bring it to debate, never was brought to vote, and it died on the order paper. This year, he hasn't even brought legislation to the fore. So it's very much this government is on the side of big corporate landlords, and I think their actions have proven it. And then, of course, what should upset most Manitobans, with high inflation, with the high cost of groceries, EIA rates have been frozen. So 56,000 most vulnerable Manitobans had their income frozen in the budget this year, which meant they got cut. No increases for food, and they're still clawing back money for EIA recipients who are working, and they're still creating a poverty trap for vulnerable Manitobans. And then, of course, not only are they ignoring the cost of living crisis, but they are making life less affordable for Manitobans. And we see that with some tax increases that occurred in this budget. Some direct, some indirect. So the direct one is they actually raised taxes on working families. Now, just to explain, because of high inflation, many families have received cost of living increases on their paycheck. And those increases sometimes can bump you up to a higher income tax bracket. And now in the higher income tax bracket, even if you're just barely there, you have to pay higher taxes. It's called bracket creep. And the way the law works in Manitoba is that the brackets are indexed with inflation, meaning so as you get your cost of living increase, the brackets go up with inflation as well, so you don't get pushed up into a higher bracket. Well, this year, Wab Kinew froze the index of tax brackets, which means that people have to now pay higher taxes on their cost of living increases. It's going to cost Manitobans $82 million, and it's mainly going to affect working families and middle-class families who are the most vulnerable for them having their taxes raised. Now, contrast this with Wab bringing in more corporate welfare. They cut the health and education levy for about 800 large profitable corporations. Now, this levy is for corporations to pay their fair share for healthcare costs and for education, which they benefit from with their workforce. Manitoba has some of the lowest corporate taxes in Canada, and this is one way where you can sort of make the tax system more fair. Well, the Kinew government cut this, but they don't have the money, which means they're going to have to borrow the money in order to replace the corporate taxes that were actually lost. And we're going to have to pay interest on that money, and your family's going to pay interest on that money for 30 years, which means less money for social services and more money going to pay interest on the debt. Right now, Manitoba spends $2 billion a year paying interest on its debt. When I started at the Ledge in 2019, that number was $900 million. It's doubled in 5 years. And that's money not going to hospitals. It's money not going to schools. It's basically going to bondholders in New York and in London, England. So the other thing you're going to see with taxation is indirect taxation. When the province doesn't fund municipalities or school boards properly, they will raise taxes too. And that's what we're seeing this year. They gave a 2% increase to municipalities like the city of Winnipeg. Well, their costs were much higher because of cost of living and inflation than 2%. So we saw this year the city of Winnipeg raise taxes on property higher than they have in a generation. We also saw that with school boards that have been chronically underfunded by Wab Kinew, and that's led to double-digit tax increases for education property taxes between 10 and 25%, depending on the community that you live. That's absolutely unheard of in my lifetime. So if you add up the school board taxes and the municipal taxes, Wab Kinew has indirectly raised your taxes by quite a bit this year. And then, of course, we talk about the underfunding in universities. So how Wab is trying to pay off the deficit is on the backs of students. He raised tuition by $6 million, which means that going to universities just got more expensive and less affordable for many middle-income families. What we're also talking about in this budget is the stuff that the government isn't doing. And obviously the chief among that is healthcare. We've heard from doctors, nurses, and allied health professionals that they say healthcare has actually gotten worse under Wab Kinew, and that he hasn't been listening to frontline healthcare workers. In fact, Health Sciences Centre emergency room is the worst performing ER in Canada. And if that wasn't bad enough, the worst 4 ERs in Canada all are in Manitoba. And in the past 18 months, we've seen 3 people die in ER waiting rooms waiting to see a doctor. And of course, wait times in Manitoba used to be on average about 2 hours. Now they're saying it's about 8 hours. In fact, these are some of the worst times in Canada. They're double the national average. So, we have a staffing shortage. This government has been slow to respond. And I'll give you an example. Last year's budget, they budgeted for 90 rural paramedics. They were only able to hire 14. So if you talk to the paramedics, they say that we need 100 rural paramedics brand new every year for the next 5 years. And we are actually not filling the ones from previous years. So we're just getting further behind. And if you want a really good illustration of how much we're underfunding healthcare in Manitoba under Wab Kinew, in 2015, the last year of the previous NDP government, Manitoba spent the 3rd most per capita in Canada on healthcare. Last year, 2024, under Wab Kinew, the projections are that Manitoba will have spent the 2nd least among Canadian provinces on a per capita healthcare in Canada. So then we talk about childcare. The province has set a goal for 23,000 new spaces by next year. They have only brought in about several thousand. In fact, only 1 in 5 children in Manitoba actually have a spot. And the few spots that have been made have been from brand new schools built in suburban or rural Manitoba. If you live in inner city Winnipeg, if you live in Fort Garry or Fort Rouge, they're just not building spaces. And part of the reason is that the funding model, the federal government will help you build spaces, but they'll only pay for 60% of the spot. You have to come up with the other 40%. And what the Kinew government is hoping is that parents or nonprofit organizations will come up with that money. Well, that's a lot of money, and they just haven't. So if you actually want to build spaces, the province of Manitoba has to come in and pony up that 40% to start building childcare spaces, and they have refused to make that commitment, and as such, they are not hitting their target. That brings us to the environment. We have gone backwards in Manitoba on the environment. In fact, it's hard for a lot of progressives to acknowledge, but in fact, the Pallister government had done more for climate change than Wab Kinew. In fact, his signature environmental policy was a gas tax holiday that he borrowed $340 million worth of taxpayer money in order to make gas cheaper, to encourage people to drive more, to pollute more. It's a huge step backwards on the environment. In fact, when he brought back the gas tax, he still made it cheaper to pollute in Manitoba. But the other sort of shocking thing that he did is, out of all the different budget areas Manitoba has, Environment was the only one that actually underspent its budget by $16 million. So they had the money. They could do environmental initiatives. They didn't. And that money was clawed back and sent to another department. And now this government is talking about spending billions of dollars building natural gas hydro generating stations in Manitoba, something that we were trying to phase our hydro grid away from. And of course, that leaves us with public safety. Manitoba is facing a drug and mental health crisis. We're seeing this leading to crime and people feeling unsafe. And the government likes to talk about being tough on the causes of crime, but there's been really no new or significant initiatives to deal with that. We don't have mental health services that are available to Manitobans. We don't have addiction services that's readily available to Manitobans. In fact, most of the money spent on public safety in this budget is going to police and investing in jails, not into keeping people out of jail and keeping people safe. Now, it's deeply expensive and it doesn't work. We've been doing that for 30 years and nobody feels any safer. But one budget item that really sort of tells you everything you need to know about the values of the Kinew government is the only budget they froze in the Justice Department was legal aid. And with inflation, a freeze is a cut. So they were cutting the only services we provide to vulnerable Manitobans who get in conflict of the law, and in order to make sure that they have, get the help that they need and get a fair shake through the justice system, we're actually defunding that. So over 82% of Manitoba jails house Indigenous inmates. They make up only 18% of the population. And we have some of the highest incarceration rates of children in the country in the youth justice system. And again, overwhelmingly Indigenous. The female prison population is overwhelmingly Indigenous. And so the Auditor General looked into this and he found that 91% of these inmates had substance abuse issues. Another 6% had mental health issues. Many of them were receiving no treatment or help in our justice system. So when people talk about a systemic racism in our justice system, that's what they're talking about, that when we send people to jail and we get tough on crime, what we're really saying is we're getting tough on Indigenous children, we're getting tough on Indigenous adults and BIPOC Manitobans, that we're getting tough on drug addicts, and we're getting tough on people suffering from mental health issues. And of course, none of that actually keeps us safe. So this is very much a government that punches down, that goes after most vulnerable Manitobans, and it panders to people's fears, and it's not going to make any of us safe, and it's deeply expensive. So the key takeaway from this budget is that Manitoba and the Kinew government have kept the PC austerity agenda, which means that they've kept the taxes for wealthy Manitoba, the tax cuts for wealthy Manitobans in place. That means that the government is underfunded, and so they have to cut services and they have to cut back on civil servants. We have a fraction of what we used to actually working for the province of Manitoba, and that means cuts to healthcare, education, social services, and also means more crime, more addictions, more mental health issues. It means more crumbling infrastructure, affordable housing crisis. It means higher tuition, higher school board and municipal taxes. And, we're not getting ahead in Manitoba. This is not how you build a province. In fact, if we went back to the tax rates from the PC Philman years, we would have no deficit in Manitoba, and we would have about $2 billion of extra money to invest in healthcare, in education. So, again, budgets are about values, and this is what we know about the Kinew government's values, and it's not good. Okay, so when you look at this budget, basically what we see in Manitoba is austerity measures, which we've been living with for about 10 years, are continuing. The Kinew government has accepted the fiscal policies of the Pallister government. And what that means is that they haven't reversed any of the tax cuts for the rich, which means that the Manitoba government doesn't have any money, which means that they have to make cuts in social services and programs in order to make up for that shortfall. And what that means for your life is that there's been cuts to healthcare, education, and social services. It means more crime, more drug addictions, more mental health issues going unaddressed. It means crumbling infrastructure. It means an affordable health or housing crisis. And it means higher tuition for students, higher school board and municipal taxes. And it means more division and uncertainty and desperate inequality, including child poverty in Manitoba. You know, if we went back to the tax rates during the PC Filmon government years, not only would we have no deficit at all, we would have billions of more money to invest in healthcare, invest in education, rebuild our infrastructure. We don't have a spending problem in Manitoba. We do have a revenue problem. In fact, as a percentage of GDP, our spending this year was 25.4%. And to put that in some perspective, the last 3 years of the PC government were all higher. So budgets are about values. We see very clearly what Wab Kinew thinks is important and who he sees and who he doesn't and what he continues to ignore. And we're not seeing a lot of hope for Manitobans who are struggling. This certainly isn't a one Manitoba budget. A lot of Manitobans are getting left behind. And Manitoba, this is not the change you voted for. As an MLA, we get letters from the public about concerns that they want addressed, and often we hear the same concerns when we're knocking on doors in our constituency. It gives us a rough guide as politicians about what issues are important to our community. In Fort Garry, we have a lot of young families with both parents working, and one of the main issues I hear is about the lack of available childcare spaces. Here's a letter from a constituent. It goes like this. So, my question for you today is simple. What is the NDP doing to help our parents of young children right now? For those of us unable to get into $10 a day funded daycare spots because the wait lists are a mile long, how can NDP help us in the interim while we wait for more ECEs to be trained and more spots to open up? That's a fantastic question. And a lot of people are wondering that 2 years into the Kinew government, and there doesn't seem to be any movement on the backlog when it comes to childcare spaces. And there's a bit of a story here that I think Manitobans need to know and explain what's going on. So the federal Liberals announced that they were bringing in universal $10 a day childcare in Canada in 2021. Manitoba ended up signing a funding deal with the federal government to build spaces. Despite that, many parents have been struggling to actually find space. So they're going, well, what's going on? Manitoba has promised that it would create 23,000 childcare spaces by 2026. You heard that, by next year. By the end of 2024, we had only created about 1,650 spaces. It would take about 39 years for us to actually reach our goal. And currently in Manitoba, there's only 1 in 5 kids that actually have access to childcare spaces. So part of the issue is the strategy that the province is employing. The federal government is only funding about 60% of these new spaces, which means that somebody has to come up with the 40% to pay for the rest of it. And if that money doesn't show up, spaces don't get created. So that's basically privatized childcare, where you need some other agency, if the government doesn't step in, to bring that money. And just think about that for a minute. If you are a parent, you're basically being encouraged to fundraise and to start up new spaces. But if you're on a board and your child has a childcare space, what's the incentive for you to fundraise for more spaces? Young parents don't have a lot of money nor a lot of time, and so that's a huge burden to place on them. Some nonprofit agencies and quasi-governments have stepped in, and one government, the Manitoba Métis Federation, has actually filled that space and then has been opening up spaces. One of the other areas that spaces have been made is when they build a brand new school. And we're building about 2 a year in Manitoba, and each one usually gets about 80 childcare spaces. So you can imagine 160 spaces a year from new schools is not going to stop the backlog. So basically, what's happened is the government hasn't brought in that 40%. The province hasn't paid that 40% to build new spaces. And because of it, we're not seeing a big growth in childcare spaces, nor are we cutting into the backlog. This year's budget is pledging 2,300 spaces for next year. So again, even by that rate, we're not getting to 20,000 spaces by the time the next election occurs, and we're not getting rid of wait times. The other problem with this is that this is a privatized state system. It's based on nonprofits doing the work instead of government. You're not seeing the province invest, and you're not seeing the government actually build out universal spaces. The other problem is staff. You can build all the spaces that you want, but if there's no staff to actually work in the spaces, then you can't actually bring kids into those spots. And that's happened a lot too. Right now, we have a funding crisis in childcare where our early childhood educators are poorly paid, and it's hard to recruit them. They have significant training they have to undergo, and it's hard to keep them. They often leave because they can get better jobs elsewhere. So until we actually recognize this as a profession that needs proper funding, we're going to see this lack of staff, and without proper staff, you can't build new spaces. And the government really hasn't been treating this issue with the urgency that it needs to be treated. And it means that we just aren't recruiting staff or keeping them, and that we can't, staff these centers even if we could open them up. There are solutions. There are things that we could be doing in Manitoba. Ontario and Quebec have full-day kindergarten, full-day nursery. Recently, the school board trustees in Manitoba have voted to press the province on creating universal full-day nursery and kindergarten here in Manitoba. That would go a long way to freeing up spaces in childcare centers. So would before and after school programs across the province. We've seen that work in other provinces, and we certainly can do that here. Something that I'm very passionate about. I'm a former school trustee, and I brought a full-day kindergarten program at the Winnipeg School Division, and a couple of my riding schools, Harrow and Earl Grey, had full-day kindergarten programs. But unfortunately, due to continuous education underfunding, those programs have been cut now, and they no longer exist. And so it really calls out that we need to properly fund our education system. We need to bring in full-day nursery and kindergarten, and we need before and after school programs, and that would go a long way to free up spaces. We also need the province to fund that 40%. The province needs to get into the childcare business. We need government childcare centers, and that funding gap is what's holding us back from actually building more spaces. So there's lots we can do. And until then, as a father of three, I certainly hear my constituents' frustration that these services aren't there when they need them. And quite frankly, they pay for themselves. So it's something the province really needs to get on. On March 24th, 2025, CBC broke a story about Premier Wab Kinew violating the conflict of ethics rules by accepting flights on the bomber plane to the 2023 and 2024 Grey Cup games. Under conflict of interest legislation, politicians cannot accept flights on private planes prior to getting approval from the ethics commissioner. And we know from media reports that that wasn't done. In fact, the premier intentionally didn't seek the ethics commissioner's approval, despite the law stating that he didn't think he needed to because he paid for the tickets. Now, the Conservatives have formally filed a complaint with the ethics commissioner, and there will be investigation. So here's what we know so far, and I want to go through it for Manitobans. Then I want to talk about why this matters, why people should care about it, because some people have been flippant about this and said, well, he paid for his own ticket, so what's the harm? Well, there is a harm here, and I want to go through what happened so you know why this is an important issue and why Manitobans should be concerned about it. So the Premier accepted a flight for himself and 3 others on the bomber plane for the 2023 Grey Cup. And despite the law saying he needed pre-approval, he didn't think it applied to him and didn't seek it. So he eventually paid the bombers market value for those 4 plane tickets. Interestingly enough, Mayor Gillingham had the exact same offer as the Premier, and he declined it, and he flew commercial because he was following City of Winnipeg ethic guidelines. This didn't come to light until CBC submitted a Freedom of Information request for the Premier's expenses. Now, a strange thing that happened with one of the Premier's expenses. Initially, the Premier's hotel room was expensed to the government, meaning that the province of Manitoba taxpayers were going to pay for his hotel stay at the Grey Cup. Now, the Premier now says he paid for his own hotel, but couldn't explain why it was placed on a provincial expense website showing that it was a government expense. Further, a government spokesperson told CBC that the government paid for this hotel room. So the Premier was asked about this inconsistency, why his version was different from an official in his own office and why it was different than the official government website, and he had no response. In September of 2024, a year after the Premier took the private plane trip to the Grey Cup, CBC requested the Premier and staff expenses for that time period. Now, the law requires that information to be released 45 days from the request. The Premier's office once again breaks the law. They don't provide it. In fact, CBC had to complain to the provincial ombudsman's office that the Premier's office had blew past the 45 days and it didn't appear that they were going to release that information. The ombudsman office then has to warn the Premier that he's violating the law and that these documents finally get released 170 days after they were initially requested. Now, during that time, the Premier once again takes a private plane trip on the bomber plane to Grey Cup now in November 2024, once again breaking the law. So if you're keeping track, that is, the Premier has now broken 3 Manitoba laws, 2 Ethics Commission laws, and 1 Freedom of Information disclosure law. So it gets worse. CBC reports that after the release of the documents, and I quote, followed by weeks of staffers providing inaccurate and contradictory information regarding the Premier's expenses, arguing the story wasn't worth reporting. Now, reporters are having an ongoing dialogue at this time with press officers and PR people inside the Premier's office, and they're getting contradictory explanations, shifting stories, and they're getting lobbied. So what happens, for Manitobans who don't know how government works, is you have communication staff who are in sort of daily conversation with reporters, and they are either feeding them information or they're trying to spin them, or in this case, which is most concerning, they were being gaslit. They were being told that there was nothing to see here, that there was no story, and therefore they shouldn't write a story. Keep in mind, the reporters had discovered that the Premier had broke 3 Manitoba laws, and taxpayer-funded employees of the government were trying to convince them that that wasn't a story and that they shouldn't write about it. So finally, on March 5th, 2025, a couple weeks before the story is published, the Premier's office now says that the Premier paid for the expenses on December 12th, 2023. Well, CBC goes, that's great. Let's have an interview. Well, the Premier won't talk about it. And they say, okay, well, why don't you hand us over the invoices and the payment information to the bomber organization so we can see it? They refused to do that. So prior to the story actually breaking, the Premier's office is asked, did you contact the Ethics Commissioner about this? They again refused to answer. And of course, we now know that they didn't. So the strange fact here is the Premier has put on a public website all his financial disclosure. He claimed that November 2023 Grey Cup hotel expenses on that website. He posted that expense in October 2024, and despite paying for it in December of that year, it stays on that website until a week before the story breaks in March 2025. So why would you have that on your website? Why would you leave it there for a year only to take it off when you know that the media is about to write a story about it? That makes absolutely no sense. So on March 5th, the Premier's office tells CBC government that they've paid for a staff person flight to Grey Cup, and then 6 days later, they now changed their story and said the Premier paid for it. Which is it? We just don't know. And finally, just before the story is published, probably one of the most concerning aspects about this is the Premier's chief of staff contacts CBC and lobbies them to kill the story, saying, and I quote, "This isn't a story." So again, to recap, the Premier has broken 3 laws. He's refused to provide invoices and receipts that could clear this up. He's refused to answer media questions on it. The story has been evolving. It's inconsistent. It's contradictory. And the Premier's actions don't match up with what's actually being disclosed on government website. So the Premier could clear this up. He could provide all these invoices. He could answer questions on it. We can know exactly what's happening, but they have refused. And again, we need to know why. So what's also telling is the reaction after the story broke. So it appears for the first time the Premier ever speaks to the Conflict of Interest Commissioner is only after CBC reports the story. And it's clear that he's motivated to do that because of bad press. He tells CBC, and I quote, "It didn't even occur to him to disclose the private flights." And this is another quote from the Premier. "So I figured paying my own way to the Grey Cup that I wouldn't have to disclose." So the Premier admits his actions were intentional. And it's a very curious thing to say because MLAs, we get briefings by the ethics commissioner as to what the law is. And I imagine the Premier and ministers get enhanced briefings. So it's not a situation where they can say they don't know the law. They also have highly trained and highly paid staff that their whole job is to keep the Premier out of these type of situations. And they know the law quite well. And they obviously can call the commissioner if there's any gray areas or any doubts, where we know that never happened in this case. And in fact, they're certainly aware of the Freedom of Information deadlines of 45 days. And so by not following them, that's clear intentional breaching of the law. And in a case like this, where there's so many questions, it's very curious why they attempted not to reveal this information, or why they didn't want to answer Manitobans' questions. Bottom line is that the Premier didn't think he did anything wrong. He didn't think he needed to disclose. And it appears that the staff around him either didn't tell him or couldn't convince him that he had a legal obligation to do something, which in and of itself raises questions and is very problematic. So that comes down to the next question. Why does this all matter? Why should you care? The Premier said he paid back the bomber organization for the flight. So why should you care? Well, here's why. The Premier got a perk. He got a gift, a very cool gift from the bomber organization. Not something that most Winnipeggers can just walk onto a bomber plane and get flown to a Grey Cup. The only reason he was allowed to do that was because of his position as Premier. Now, keep in mind, the province of Manitoba gives money to the bomber organization, over $800,000 in that year alone for various different programs. And so the bomber organization is a stakeholder and is giving gifts to a Premier who has the power to take money or give them money. The perception obviously is horrible. It's a perception that he's getting special treatment from somebody that he gives money to. And that is a perk, and that's why it's a conflict of interest, and that's why we have to guard against our officials from doing this. But the second major issue here that Manitobans should be concerned about is that, as the saying goes, it's not the crime, it's the cover-up. The Premier's office and the Premier's response to what happened here is troubling deeply troubling. The only way I can describe that, it shows a pattern of institutional dishonesty. Again, the people working in the Premier's office are paid by taxpayers, and they tried to cover up what happened. They tried to cover up the Premier breaking Manitoba law 3 times and advocating for this story not to go ahead. They were gaslighting the media, and the media is providing a public service. They're basically asking questions that Manitobans would ask themselves, and they're there to hold the government account. They're speaking truth to power. So when the government lies to them, they're essentially lying to all of us. They're our proxy. So the Premier's office didn't want this to come out. They tried to cover it up, and they used taxpayer dollars to do it, and they gaslighted reporters along the way. So how is Manitobans, and I guess the media, ever supposed to trust anything that comes out of the Premier's office? And of course, you've heard that there's been no consequence to whatever government officials were involved in this. They've still kept their job. They probably got a pat on the back. And what's to prevent them from doing this on other issues? And the third concerning issue here is the Premier's refusal to answer questions on this, the refusal to provide documents. They basically obstructed this story from start to finish, and they attended to obscure what happened. They claim they didn't do anything wrong. Well, show the documents if that's true. And they refused to disclose them to sort of back up what they're saying, which again makes no sense. And why are you working so hard to try to kill the story? And why are you breaking freedom of information laws by refusing to disclose these things from the beginning? So here's the bottom line. The Premier's behavior is concerning here. It shows an element of entitlement, and there's a lack of appreciation of ethics and a willingness to accept special gifts from people who receive money from the government. It's an attitude that the rules don't apply to him, that he needs to be exempted from the rules, or that everybody else is required. And it should be pointed out that none of his ministers seem to have a problem following this rules, and his own ministers have been following the law and have been filing reports with the ethics commissioner when they go on private planes. So the Premier takes the position, well, I paid for these tickets, so what's the harm? And of course, it's just deeply concerning that he doesn't understand what he did wrong here, and what are the chances of him repeating it if he doesn't see the harm in this. And of course, contrast that with Mayor Gillingham, who followed the law to the T. There was no issues with him. He did what Manitobans expected of him. So finally, the Premier's office response to this scandal is troubling. We have this sort of institutional dishonesty where we are paying as taxpayers money to government staff to lie to us. That taxpayer money is being lobbied to try to kill negative media stories. So how can Manitobans believe anything that comes from the Premier's office? How will they know they're not being gaslit? This is a breach of trust. And no one has been disciplined or fired from the Premier's office. No staff is being held accountable. And that's the culture we're seeing in the Premier's office, and it's toxic. So right now, 45% of Manitobans don't vote. In every election, that number grows. And what does it say when nearly half of the population has given up on provincial politics and do not want to participate? And it's because of events like this, cynical politicking like this, that people get turned off in politics. And when that happens, we all lose. All right, thank you for joining us for the very first edition of The Ledge, and I'd love to hear from you. We are on all social media channels. You can reach out there or follow us, but you can also reach us by email to tell us what you think at mark@markwasiliumla.ca, and hope to hear from you soon.